Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. I'd like to start by telling you a little bit about Wildlife Watch. Wildlife Watch is an investigative reporting project supported by National Geographic Society and National Geographic Partners that seeks to shine a light on commercial-scale wildlife crime and exploitation. The illegal wildlife trade is valued somewhere between $7 and $20 billion a year. And it is not just a major driver of species decline, but it leads to corruption, it contributes to the exploitation of indigenous communities, to the erosion of civil society, to say nothing of the suffering of the individual animals involved. With Wildlife Watch, our goal is always to have an impact. We aim to do stories that make a difference. And our stories have, our Wildlife Watch reporting team has had some positive impacts. With pangolins, for example, just last week I heard from a mother asking me for a recommendation of a pangolin rescue organization because her kids wanted to donate their allowance. Our wildlife tourism reporting helped lead to Instagram developing a pop-up message whenever a user searches for a hashtag that's potentially associated with a problematic wildlife practice. Wildlife Watch reporting has led to high-level government discussions about how better to protect jaguars from poaching in Suriname, and has led to law enforcement raids on restaurants in Vietnam serving critically endangered giant freshwater fish. And one of my favorites, after Canadian authorities stopped the smuggling of leeches from Russia, there were 12,000 of them, and every single one of those leeches found new homes after our story ran. The June issue of National Geographic is one we're especially proud of. It features a package of 3 Wildlife Watch stories: the hidden cost of wildlife tourism, the world's most trafficked mammal, the pangolin, and a group of incredible women in Zimbabwe who put their lives on the line every day to protect wildlife from poachers. So let me tell you a little bit about this story first. This story is about the global captive wildlife tourism industry. Social media has totally changed the game here. All of a sudden, there is this massive demand for up-close, hands-on interaction with wildlife that didn't exist before. The journalists who worked on this story went to 6 countries in 4 continents, starting in the Amazon, and then heading to other tourist hotspots, including Thailand, Russia, and the United States. And what they found was, behind these once-in-a-lifetime experiences was serious animal suffering. This story is about the world's only known mammal with true scales, the pangolin. Pangolins are trafficked by the ton for their scales, in demand for traditional Chinese medicine, and also for their meat, which is considered a luxury food. And even though they are believed to be the world's most trafficked mammal, most people in the West, outside of the conservation community, have never even heard of a pangolin, yet they're on the verge of extinction. Photographer Brent Stirton and I worked on this story for almost 2 years. We went to Zimbabwe, Cameroon, Cote d'Ivoire, Uganda, Vietnam, and China, tracing the illegal trade in pangolins from poaching to final consumer. And what we found was that there are some really dedicated people working to rescue and rehabilitate pangolins and to stop the illegal trade. But there are also major loopholes that are allowing the illegal trade to continue. Now I would like to introduce you to our panel. We have Brent Stirton, photographer and National Geographic Fellow, Natasha Daly, a writer and editor at National Geographic, and Kirsten Luce, photojournalist. Please welcome the panel. So what I'd like to start with is all of these stories had really upsetting parts to report. They're tough stories. And one thing I've often struggled with in telling these stories is you want to show the readers what exactly is happening because you need to get them to care. But at the same time, sometimes if something is too intense, too gory, too sad, you might get people putting their fingers in their ears, running away, and just wanting to pretend it's not happening. So Natasha, let me ask you first. Was this something you thought about when you were writing the wildlife tourism story? And how do you try to avoid empathy fatigue?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something I thought about. The last thing you want is when you're reporting a story that is full of difficult, experiences of suffering to turn readers off and make them not even want to read it. But I think I made a pretty deliberate decision, I think, from the beginning, after I finished reporting and just before I started to actually write the story, to not hold back. And I think the reason I did that was because this entire industry exists because people don't necessarily know what's going on behind the curtain, behind the scenes. And in order to tell this story in a way that was compelling, in a way that was effective, I felt like I really had to lay bare exactly what was going on, or else it wouldn't be doing the job.
Yeah, one thing, it's funny, for me, when I was writing Pangolins, it was actually kind of the opposite. And I think maybe that's because the basic premise of the story already was that pangolins are being killed in large scale. Like, we didn't need to convince readers of that already. So, for example, like with this photo, this woman was about to slaughter that pangolin. And I mean, we were there for the entire process, but this was the photo that we ended up using in the story. What do you think? We didn't have to really show the bloody bits to get people to care.
No, I think there's enough menace in this one. But, I think trauma is an engine, yeah? I think that if you experience trauma in the coverage of your stories, you have a greater chance of putting that into your pictures or into your words. That's your job. Personally, if you're not feeling something, you shouldn't be there in the first place. That's just common sense. There's that cliche, you're a tourism in someone else's tragedy. That's the bottom line.
Yeah, I think it's very true.
You ask about empathy fatigue, and I think we, even reporting this story, we actually lived, I feel like, empathy fatigue. We were in the field for 3 months in total, reporting on the suffering within the wildlife tourism industry, and I think we encountered dealing with empathy fatigue ourselves. It was sustained exposure to animal suffering, and so it's like, at the beginning, what you see, you're shocked by, and you have to process that, but then as days go by, it starts to become a little more normalized, and that's something, I think it helped us do our job. I think it helped us get what we needed to get, but at the same time, I understand what that's like.
It's a really challenging balance to strike.
Yeah.
That's why intention is so important. If you have clarity on what your intent is for these stories right from the beginning, all of that is bearable. So not happening to you, it's not happening to your animals. You have a duty to report on it.
Right.
So everybody on stage is a storyteller, and often it can be really hard to fit everything we want to say into a story. So real quick, I want to go down the line. Was there any anecdote or fact or piece of your reporting that didn't make it into the final story that you wish people knew?
Of course, there's so many, but we, again, reported the story for about 3 months, and the very first place we went was the Amazon, and we went to this village called Puerto Alegria, Peru, and there they have a viewing platform. So these Colombian tour operators would bring the relatively rich Colombians across the river by the boatload, where they could pose and take selfies with sloths, caimans, anteaters, margays. They had 7 or 8 different species of animals that they had plucked from the wild to pose with. This was, of course, concerned to us, fit right into our story. We wanted to understand what happened when the tourists left. So here we followed Larissa, who's 8, back to her home. And I was chatting with her in Spanish and her brother, and I said, well, where does the sloth sleep? And her brother, without skipping a beat, said, oh, well, he sleeps up in the trees, but we feed him so he comes down in the morning. And as I'm thinking to myself, that doesn't sound so bad. And I translate to Natasha, and she's looking at me like, no, he's lying to you. And I realized immediately that I was being duped by a 10-year-old, that even this 10-year-old already had a backstory to sort of preserve my feelings as a tourist, those fuzzy feelings that I have about his animals. So that sort of set the tone. This was a couple days into the very first trip. We came across this time and time again. Every owner, handler, or trainer had this convenient backstory that kind of softened the situation for the tourist. I think the most ridiculous one we learned was Stepan, the Siberian brown bear in Russia. He lives in Moscow, and his backstory is that his mother had been shot in the woods, and he had been orphaned, and then raised by Svetlana and Yuri, who loved him like family and raised him like a son. Well, The real story is that these are circus trainers that bought the bear from a zoo and trained him to star in commercials and become famous. So we've received so much hate mail about misportraying Stepan because people don't realize that that's not his real story, and they want to cling to that story.
It's a lot easier to believe those stories.
Yes.
Yeah, and like we found that everything is so easy to justify when your intention is pure, and that's something we encountered time and time again in reporting this story. You know, someone might say, "Oh, I would never watch an elephant show, but you know, I'd ride one," or you know, "I would never ride an elephant, but I'd bathe one." And so it's that continued justification that is what we encountered over and over, because people love animals, they want to get close to them, and it's simple.
Brent, anything that you wish had made it into the story?
Okay, so guys, a lot of our work with animals leads to China, yeah? China is interesting because it's such an economic powerhouse, and so many business relations are predicated on, you know, keeping harmonious relations with China. So I went to China, and people told me that there would be no way that I could get access to pangolins in China in restaurants, etc. What was amazing was that within 2 days and 2 taxi rides, I was in 3 different restaurants where I could find pangolins. And that just tells me everything that I want to know. We're going to have to deal with China, guys, whether it's on conservation issues or not. I think conservation is a metaphor, because whether we're talking about rare earth minerals, or we're talking about water, or we're talking about animals, we're not having the dialogue that we need to be having. I had an interesting conversation this morning with a woman from the South China Post who is doing a pangolin story. And, you know, of 1.5 billion people, I think there's a great many empathetic Chinese that we're not talking to.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. So one issue that I love to talk about is the difference between animal welfare and wildlife conservation. So wildlife tourism was a story that was squarely focused in animal welfare, and pangolins had some welfare elements, but was primarily focused on conservation. And one thing I've noticed in my own reporting is that conservationists often look at people who advocate for animal welfare and see them as bleeding hearts, missing the forest for the trees, whereas animal welfare advocates will look at conservationists and think, oh, that's so cold-hearted, you know, how do you not care about individual suffering? And one thing, you know, with Wildlife Watch is we think both are equally important. So what I want to ask everybody is, how can we bring both of these issues together more in our reporting?
It's tricky. And I think actually that tension is something we actually encountered in the reporting of our story. So for example, we would go to facilities, and whether it was printed on their website or whether it was something they told visitors through the course of their visit, many facilities would say, you know, your money that you're paying today to get close and pet these animals is going back to conservation initiatives. And that was sometimes absolutely true. Other times we found that it wasn't. But I think that we found that visitors and tourists were very quick to sort of justify what they were doing, saying, okay, well, I'm ultimately doing good for the world because part of my ticket price is going to fund conservation. So I think that that sort of tension is something that really ran through and ultimately sort of impeded the welfare of the animals at the facilities we were visiting. And even the story itself, I think that even still, now that it's published, people often, even within the National Geographic kind of sphere, misinterpret the story as a conservation story. And it's not. It was a story that was squarely focused on the suffering of animals, whether they are imperiled in the wild or not. And by telling the story, we felt like we were able to sort of, you know, put it out there and let it be an important issue on its own. And yeah, I think they absolutely can live together. I think they can coexist, but the challenge comes down to mutual understanding and respect between the two spheres.
So I personally, I feel that these arguments that occur between those two sides are immature. I think we don't have the luxury of that time right now. What we should be doing is working together. I think rhinos are a good example of that. I can't tell you the amount of time. I'm South African, and I have sat in a room and watched guys shout at each other on a number of occasions, when in fact they have great capacity to help each other and understand each other's issues better. You know, for me, the time of being polarized in this kind of thinking is over. You know, when it comes to the legalization argument for rhino horn, for example, These are people who can work together on the legislation that's necessary to set up a legal trade, instead of which you watch arguments which lead to stalemates, which lead to no advances whatsoever. So once again, for me, it's an immature response to be having that argument in the first place.
Was there anything you wanted to add, Kirsten? Okay. So let's talk about impact for a moment. Already with pangolins, for example, some positive impact has come, such as the establishment of the Pangolin Crisis Fund. But Brent, what else do you think needs to happen in order for us to really start making a difference with pangolins?
You know, what's so amazing about the traditional medicine trade, guys, is that there are so many alternatives. Okay, for example, with pangolin scales, the number one use, 28% of the use of pangolin scales is for ease in lactation with breastfeeding women. There are over 100 alternatives, all herbal, to that situation. But we're not having that conversation. I mean, it should be such a simple thing. That's why I say again, you know, the fact that we don't have dialogue on these issues, that we are afraid to enter into dialogue. It's an interesting time with China at the moment, watching what the Trump administration is doing, the tariffs issues, et cetera, et cetera. It's the beginning of dialogue. So while a lot of this is happening in quite a negative way, I'm happy to see that at least we are confronting China on some of these issues. My hope is that it leads to a more mature dialogue. I think that, you know, once again, conservation is a metaphor here.
Yeah, and so just to be clear, while the international trade in pangolin scales has been banned, within China itself, there is a legal trade in pangolin products, and most of that is traditional Chinese medicine products. I spoke to one practitioner, though, who told me he had identified, I think, more than 100 different alternatives that could be used for the exact same purpose. So while I don't think there's, you know, people are never going to stop using traditional Chinese medicine, there's ways it can be practiced so it doesn't use endangered species.
It should be simple, right? That should just be common sense, you know?
So continuing our conversation about impact. Kirsten, one of the things you guys found was that social media is one of the major drivers of inhumane wildlife tourism, but in your storytelling, you've also used it to have a positive effect. Can you tell us a little bit about reader reaction to your story and the role social media has played?
Sure. I mean, like you said, wildlife tourism has changed dramatically with social media. There's viral advertising all the time. If an influencer or a friend of yours posts themselves with an elephant and you're going to Thailand, you think, well, I want to do that too. And you can even geotag it and go right there to the same place they did. So that kind of fueled it and sort of normalized this, became more and more ubiquitous. We've all seen these images floating around. But as the conversation sort of shifts, like we're noticing more of a sea change, and you know, to their credit, animal welfare activists have been speaking out and denouncing these activities for a long time. But to see a message like this coming from such a huge and trusted mainstream platform like National Geographic, the conversation really does appear to be shifting. I mean, I'm seeing hundreds and hundreds of people posting on my posts on the Instagram, or tagging Natasha or I on other people's Instagrams, and starting to have conversations like, oh no, do you think our tiger was drugged? And oh no, was this us? Did we do this? And just those little things are really heartening, because you're seeing these messages start to proliferate. So, and like I said before, geotags can also be used for positive, right? You can start looking at the places you're going to go and seeing what they actually look like before you support them. It's an unfiltered platform that almost anyone can access. So in that case, it could be used for good as well.
So can you guys tell me, maybe let's go down the line, what the number one takeaway you each want people to get from your story and from your reporting?
I think, you know, like Natasha has said, everybody sort of justifies what it is they want to do. So these baby tigers are sped bred, and their entire lives are spent something like this. When they're baby, you might be able to snuggle them, and as they grow up, they're kept in these cages. So whatever experience you have, even if it's well-meaning and you think it's relatively benign because it only lasts for a few moments, just think about that experiencing happening time and time again, over and over, as busloads of tourists pour into these places, and then think whether or not you think it's okay.
Yeah, a moment for you, but
A lifetime.
endless lifetime for the animal. How about you, Natasha?
So I would say to me, the most important thing that I kind of want people to realize is that this whole industry is driven by consumer demand. It lives and dies on what the tourist and the visitor and the citizen of the world is willing to pay for. These experiences exist because people want them to exist. And as people maybe start to evolve and start to realize what's really going on, and if they find it something that they don't agree with and they want something different, then the experiences themselves will change. So this whole industry can be changed by you and by me and by our readers. So that's really important.
That's encouraging. What about you, Brent?
I think my takeaway is that it's going away. Ultimately, if we don't start learning how to speak to each other, we've got 10 years on most things at this point. I don't have to tell you what the statistics are. I think that the world is approaching crisis on a number of levels: overpopulation, climate change, environmental crisis, etc. And my hope is that it forces us to talk to each other. Because every time we do that, we find we have far more in common than we have difference. But the rate at which this is accelerating is worrying. And I'm always very grateful to National Geographic for publishing these kinds of stories, because the truth is we have far too few publications looking at these kinds of things. And journalism is not in a strong state at this time. Yet it remains, more valuable than people have given it credit. I think we've undermarketed the true value of good truth-telling in the last 15 years, and we've learned something about that in the last 2 years. So for me, I applaud National Geographic for continuing to do this kind of work.
I think for me, I guess there are two takeaways from our pangolin story for me. First is just the very simple fact that pangolins exist. I think I've taken that for granted since we've been working on this for so long. And I've only been talking to people who know that pangolins exist, that most of the Western world has never heard of or seen a pangolin. And you have to know the animal to love it and want to save it. Sure. So I think that's incredibly important. And the other thing is just how dire the situation is. So in this photo, for example, this is a rescued pangolin. He was rescued by an organization called Save Vietnam's Wildlife, and he has been rehabilitated, and he is on his way to freedom. It's a really happy photo. But at the same time, what we have to keep in mind, and we heard this story again and again, is that even though pangolins can be rehabilitated and re-released, there's a good chance they're just going to be poached again. And what one woman had told me in Cameroon, Angelia Young, who works on these issues, she said the best we can hope for is that the pangolin will breed and have babies before it's poached again and contribute just 1 or 2 more babies to the population. And that was a really sombering message. So pangolins exist, and we love them. Okay, so we've got about 6 minutes left. I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience. You can just raise your hand, and there's somebody with a microphone who will come around. Let's start with you in the front.
Is that your mom? Okay.
If scientific research was done on pangolins, I've seen them in the wild, and proved that they don't help anything, is there a way that could be communicated and help them with the same applying to other creatures? They don't medically help.
No, sorry. Can you repeat that, please?
I missed the first part of what you said. Could you repeat that?
Could scientific research be done on pangolin scales and proven that they have no medical use, benefit, and have that communicated, now that we have the internet and so forth, would that help protect them?
Ma'am, that argument has been made, but what you're up against is a 5,000-year mythology in terms of traditional medicine across Asia. And that mythology is consistently marketed, and it is stronger than the facts. It's a placebo at best, but the power of the placebo in these societies is vast. And, for me, that's a leadership issue. And there are a number of Asian leaders at this point who are strong believers in traditional medicine, so we're up against it there.
We've got a hand down here.
Hi, I work in tourism, and we have to work sometimes with operators who offer these camps, and it's hard to convince them. And how do you handle the rage that you feel when you're witnessing an event like slaughtering a pangolin? And how much do you think you can convince people who've been doing this for years to change their way? And what do you think are the arguments that work?
Do you want to answer that?
Who wants to handle rage? There's definitely a lot of it.
So rage is an engine, yeah? So you get upset and you channel that into making effective imagery or great words, okay? Because at that moment, your responsibility is much bigger than that moment. You have the opportunity, the best opportunity in print in the world to talk about that issue. So go there.
And for me, it's not so much rage, but sometimes a sense of hopelessness, especially, for example, that photo of the pangolin about to be slaughtered. We were standing there and we just had to witness it. We couldn't do anything to help that one individual animal. And so you just had to keep reminding myself over and over again that what we're doing is we're going to bring the issue to a broader audience and hope that that helps make a difference.
Yeah, for me it was guilt. I struggled with a lot of guilt witnessing these situations up close and, leaving and going back to my life, and the animals would remain there forever. Elephants live for 80 years. This is their life. They live as long as people. So it was, again, I think I coped with it in the same way that Rachael did, is that, we're there. Our job is to document this so that people even know this suffering exists. And that sort of is what kept me going.
Yeah, knowing that that platform existed, that these pictures would see the light of day and they would have an impact helped dramatically. Yeah. But this one injured elephant that's gotten so much attention, Goliatham, that we showed here, he's representative of hundreds of other elephants that are in horrible situations. So the scale of the problem is much larger than even what we saw.
And I guarantee that your pictures and your words will have eased the suffering of some of the animals that you saw. That's the reality of it, isn't it? I think you were effective.
Maybe.
It's kind of as good as it gets.
I mean, there's there was a few years ago, the Tiger Kingdom, in Chiang Mai was shut down because of a lot of these reasons. And then I'd say half of the tigers disappeared. Nobody knows what happened to them. I mean, when the government isn't on the same side of helping, it's not. And also the Chinese tourists, we didn't even get into that.
Oh, yeah.
The Chinese tourists are now coming over in droves, higher than they ever have before. And when Western tourists are choosing more ethical experiences, they're filling the seats at the worst places.
Sure.
The saving grace of this for us is that this whole industry is driven by consumers. So it doesn't matter what the laws are. All of this stuff is legal that we documented. But if people want something different, the experiences change on a dime like that. And we were witnessing that start to happen. So there's hope.
We have time for one more quick question. Hand in the back, middle.
Thank you so much for sharing these stories. I was just wondering, you mentioned that a lot of the caretakers were kind of giving you some excuses or fake stories. So how did you manage to gain their trust and take some of the pictures of the behind the scenes?
Most of the stuff is very much visible to tourists. I mean, you can't hide an elephant, and they interact with the tourists and they'll go back to where they stay. So, I mean, you'd be surprised. All of these things I was able to find by just spending a lot of time and poking around. A few things we had to get special permission for in Russia, especially. But I mean, these things are quite visible. We learned to ask questions of everybody and not trust anyone. So the same way you'd report an investigative piece, you just have to ask 4 or 5 people. You start getting different answers and you get closer and closer to the truth.
Yeah.
So there are copies of the June issue outside if you haven't seen it. Feel free to take a look. And thank you for coming to our panel.